If Iran were to close off the Strait of Hormuz, it would really be the nuclear option. It'd be worse than a nuclear bomb because it would paralyze the global economy. So most of Southeast Asia, specifically China, Japan, and South Korea, depend on most of its oil and energy from the Middle East. If that were to happen, then these economies were to shudder and they would have to respond militarily, especially China and Japan. That really is the trump card that Iran can play. So I imagine that we still have pretty far to go in the escalation ladder before Iran plays that trump card. And it's just my best guess as to what's going to happen is that Trump's going to authorize airstrikes, and then Iran is going to retaliate against Israel because Israel doesn't participate in the airstrikes. Iran is also going to retaliate against local Middle East allies, including Jordan, and Iran will strike at U.S. bases in the region for its proxies, Hezbollah and the Houthis specifically. I believe there's an escalation ladder, and we have to climb pretty far up in the escalation ladder before Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Because if they were to do that, this would basically be World War III. It would draw in a lot of nations, and the consequences, it's not really contained anymore. It would be very unpredictable and unprecedented if Iran were to close off the Strait of Hormuz. From the Chinese perspective, what Trump is really doing is initiating a long-term strategy of strangling China economically. If you read the National Security Strategy, which came out last month, it's very explicit that the United States cannot challenge China in the Southeast Asia militarily. What it's going to do is that it's going to use its proxies like Japan, and it's going to strangle China economically. Now, the problem with China is that its major strength is exports. So if the United States were to close off the first island chain, which is Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and if there were a war in Iran, then China would be strangled economically because it could not access oil. So I know that Russia is providing 20% of China's energy needs, but 20% is not a lot. And the reality is that Russia is having problems meeting that demand right now. So it's going to take, 5 to 10 years before the Trans-Siberian pipeline is online and Russia can provide more energy to China. And that's why the United States is going to strike now. From a Chinese perspective, I'm saying this from a Chinese military perspective, that the real reason that Trump is going after Iran is to destroy Chinese economy. So if you're China, you have no choice but to bolster Iran. They're going to send weapon systems. They're going to send financing. They're going to do whatever they can to support Iran. But there are some red lines. So China will not send soldiers, and China will not declare war on the United States.
Do you think that China might send naval vessels into the region?
Yeah, so the issue is that China doesn't have a blue water navy to challenge the American Navy, the blue water navy. But I think what's going to happen this year is that very quickly, Russia is going to transform its shadow fleet. It's about 1,000 ships into a blue water navy. There's no way that Russia can defeat America in the oceans, but Russia at least has to challenge America. It basically has to create a war of attrition in the seas that would hamper America's aggression against Iran. And China would provide financing for Russia's blue water navy. So I think that's what's most likely to happen. So my feeling is that they will attack Iran. They will use airstrikes. It will be very impressive. They will hit a lot of military targets. It'll be very sustained. But airstrikes by themselves are not effective. And eventually, Trump's going to halt airstrikes and move attention elsewhere. But then he'll resume airstrikes at a later point. So I think that this U.S.-Iran conflict will be in the background throughout 2026. Unless Trump is willing to commit ground troops, he cannot actually achieve any of his war in Iran. The regime is far too resilient, far too resourceful, far too cohesive. I do think that Trump will strike Iran because that's always been part of the plan. Remember, back in his first term, there's a clear trend towards confrontation with Iran. So Trump immediately withdrew from the nuclear deal. Then he transferred the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is extremely provocative. He initiated something called the Abraham Accords, which sought to bring peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And the most provocative thing he did, of course, was in January 2020, he authorized the assassination of General Soleimani, who was the Iranian de facto envoy in the Middle East. And that essentially is a declaration of war. So if he had stayed in office, then we would have seen military strikes against Iran. He lost in 2020, but now he's back in the second term. He is going to continue the policies from his first term, which is just seek regime change in Iran. Trump has basically declared war on Latin and South America. So you have countries like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico that are not obeying him. They're not being sufficiently deferential to him. Now, Brazil exports a lot of agricultural products to China, especially soybeans. And Trump is angry about about that as well, because remember when Trump imposed tariffs on China responded by cutting agricultural imports from the United States, which hurts farmers in America, which supposedly hurts the MAGA base. And then China started to import a lot of agricultural products from Brazil. So what Trump wants to do is basically strangle South America and prevent trade between China and South America, which forces China to look for agricultural products in North America, United States, and Canada. Also, if there's a war that breaks out in Iran, then China needs oil. And so China is now forced to buy oil from Canada and the United States. Okay, so that's one element of what's going on. Okay, that's number one. Number two is we have to remember what the Canadian economic model is. There are three pillars to the Canadian economic model. The first is sell resources to America. 77% of Canadian trade is with America. That's number one. Number two is exploit cheap immigrant labor. Canadians don't actually work. They get immigrants to do the work for them. I know this because my dad was a dishwasher and had two managers who were Canadian. That's number two. But number three, and which people don't ignore, is money laundering. Help corrupt officials from around the world launder their ill-gotten gains in Canadian real estate. The very important idea is these EVs that are coming into Canada, they're meant to be the spearhead for this massive collaboration between Chinese companies and Canadian companies, which allows Chinese companies to launder resources into Canada. So it's money laundering. But the other aspect is this. But Canada has become a toxic asset, and where real estate is completely overpriced. And so they're trying to dump this toxic asset onto the Chinese. So what Carney really wants is access to the household savings of the average Chinese citizen, which is about 40%. So in Canada, the average Canadian household has about 100% debt to income ratio. So basically Canadians owe more than they actually earn. But in China, Chinese will save 40% of all their income. That's a huge financial resource for Carney to tap into. So what Carney wants, he doesn't care about selling canola to the Chinese. Who cares? That's like opinions. What he really wants is a new economic relationship between Canada and China, where the Chinese households are able to divert a lot of their savings to Canadian resources. So imagine Chinese buying houses in Canada. Imagine Chinese sending their kids to Canada for university. But also imagine Chinese through stable coins buying Canadian currency. So that I think is the grand plan. Because again, Carney's a banker. He thinks like a banker. He thinks about how to package a financial resource and sell it really expensive to stupid investors. Okay, that's how he thinks. So I think that's a grand strategy here. And Trump's going to go along with it because this for Trump is really the ideal arrangement between China and the United States as well. So let Carney test the water, see how the Chinese respond, and then when Trump visits Beijing in April, negotiate the same deal.
And do you think the Chinese government appreciates fully that this is the long-term strategy of the banker?
The decisions are not usually made, high-level decisions, are not usually made between government and government. They're usually made between central bank and central bank. So the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, that's a coordinating body of the central banks. And that's where they come together and they discuss their problems and the solutions. The Canadians have a problem because it's entirely based on money laundering. It's a Ponzi scheme. So they need people to come in and store their resources in Canada. That's how the thing works. The Chinese have a problem because their people refuse to spend their money. And the Chinese refuse to spend their money because the Chinese have absolutely no confidence in the future. There's no safety net. The pension is not reliable. Their children is not going to have a great future. So they need to save us up as much money as possible for the future. But the problem from the economic perspective is that that's actually kind of productive. You need people to spend their money for the economy to function. If the money is staying in the bank dormant, that creates a lot of issues. And one major issue is, of course, is trade imbalance, where China has like 1.2 trillion trade surplus with the rest of the world, which is just, it doesn't help the Chinese at all. So the Chinese central bank has a problem of like how to increase consumption. The Canadian central bank has a problem of how to absorb more of savings from around the world. So I think that these guys had serious discussions at the Bank of International Settlements. They've come to an agreement, and that's why Carney went to Beijing. Okay? Because remember, there had to be an agreement in place for these leaders to meet. The two leaders meet in order to sign the MOU. And that's not going to sit together for like days and days to negotiate the deal. That's what underlings do. So I think there's already been an agreement in place, and how this agreement will pan out is something that we will observe over the next year. So the Chinese political system, it's very strange for Westerners. EVs, it's not an economic tool, it's a political tool. And what I mean by that is, think of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, where the government spent billions and billions of dollars on creating this amazing show for the world. So it's a political show. And that's what EVs are. EVs are a sign that China is technologically advanced, that it's not just a sweatshop to the world, that it is one of the leading technological centers of the world. And it's all part of China's like grand strategy to be a technological powerhouse. So the problem with EVs is that they're heavily subsidized by the government. So people don't appreciate this, but EVs lose money because they're all heavily subsidized subsidized by the government, and there's overcapacity in China. So like everywhere you go, there are lots of EVs, but they can't actually sell all the EVs in China. So for Canada to start selling EVs, for Canadians to start buying Chinese EVs, for Chinese EV companies to open shop in Canada, it would be a huge political victory for the Chinese leadership. And that's all they care about. I did read Mark Carney's speech, and he makes in his speech two major historical allusions. The first is to Thucydides, and Thucydides is writing about the Peloponnesian War, and the war was fought between Athens and Sparta. So Athens had defeated the Persians, and because of that, the Aegean Sea Greeks were very thankful to the Athenians, just as the Europeans were very thankful to the Americans for defeating fascism in Europe. And so after the Persian Wars, they created something called the Delian League. It was meant to be a mutual defense pact. But over time, Athens, as a hegemon, started to exploit its allies. It became a mafia regime, and it started to extort its allies. And then its allies had no choice but to seek relief from Sparta. So I think that with this Thucydides allusion, Mark Carney is sort of like hinting to his audience that we are at this moment when America's former allies have turned into their vassals. And so America is going to exploit us. America is going to steal our wealth. America is going to make us fight wars we cannot possibly win, probably in Ukraine. And so we need to band together and seek relief from another Sparta. Today's Sparta would be China. So I think that's the first historical allusion he's making. The second historical allusion he's making, of course, is to Václav Havel's famous essay, The Power of the Powerless. And, it's very ironic he does that because in his speech, he says that, okay, let's be honest. From day one, we knew this rules-based international order was a fraud. It was hypocritical, but we benefit from it because we were friends of the hegemon, the great empire. And so we benefited. But now that the empire is turning against us, now that the empire wants to cannibalize us, we must now speak truth to power. So you can imagine the hypocrisy. So I don't think it's much of a strategy because I think anyone with a brain, which obviously precludes Canadians, but anyone with a brain can see through the hypocrisy, the travesty, and the self-indulgence in his speech. It's not really a grand strategy. It's more of a lament. It's lamentation of we used to be best friends with America. We benefited a great deal. Now America has abandoned us. We're a jilted lover, and now we're forced to band together and seek a new ally in China. So I read the speech more like that. And he has like three grand suggestions for moving forward. The first, of course, is to speak truth to power, to recognize the severity of the situation and be honest with ourselves. The second is to create, as you say, a new system of rules-based international order, of institutions that could counterbalance the bullying of America. And the third is to rely more heavily on Canadian capital and talent. The problem in Canada, you know this, is that everyone's fleeing. Capital is fleeing, talent is fleeing Canada. So Canada's being hollowed out. So as a banker, and Mark Carney used to work for Goldman Sachs, he used to be governor of the Bank of Canada, and then he went to England, became the first foreign governor of the Bank of England. He is a banker who serves transnational capital. And the reality is that Canada, the nation, I hate to say this because I grew up there, but Canada, it's a toxic asset right now. Housing prices are sky high. The Canadian economy, 40% of the Canadian economy is real estate speculation. Canada is this glorified money laundering operation. It's lost all its legitimacy by supporting this genocide in Gaza. There are hundreds of thousands of homeless in Canada, yet Carney still continues to send tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine to fight a pointless war, causing about 1 million Ukrainians to die for no particular reason. These Canadian companies refuse to invest in the country, and many of them are fleeing the country. So Canada is a toxic asset, and what you do with a toxic asset as a banker is you sell it to foreigners. And who are the foreigners? The Qataris and the Chinese. So that's the grand strategy that Carney has. And everything else, like this grand rhetoric about a rules-based international order, it's just, as you say, marketing. That's all it is. Don't pay any attention to it. Watch what he does. So what he's going to do is this. He's going to call an early election, probably late spring, April. He's going to win by a landslide. He's going to have a super majority, and then he'll start to asset strip Canada. That's the plan. Pretty simple.
What is motivating these incessant accusations of Chinese government interference in Canadian domestic politics?
So when I was younger, I read a lot of John le Carré novels. I'm not sure if you read him. His real name is David Cornwall, and he used to work for MI6. And so he knows a lot about the British intelligence service. And the thing that comes across very clearly in his novels is that these guys are always trying to justify their existence. They're basically bureaucrats. They're always looking to create threats. And they often create threats with their enemies because at the end of the day, these spies benefit actually more from working together than they do from fighting against each other. It's all a manufactured threat. And as you say, the Chinese government does not benefit at all from interfering in Canadian politics. And quite honestly, it doesn't have the expertise, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the time to go interfere in Canadian politics. Why would you want to do that? The Indian government has a lot of reasons to interfere in Canadian politics. Does anyone talk about what a threat India is? So
Yeah.
it's very silly.
I couldn't agree more.